David and Goliath, the story. Everyone gets wrong. David and Goliath may be the most famous battle in the entire Bible, but if you've only heard the version from children's books, you probably don't know what actually happened. Not the size of Goliath, not the age of David, not the weapon he carried, and not the real reason he refused the king's armor. The Bible tells a far more fascinating story than the one most people grew up with. Let's go back to 1 Samuel 17 and find out what it actually says. The armies of Israel and the Philistines were camped on opposite hillsides, with the valley of Elah stretched out between them, neither side willing to attack down into the open ground first. Meanwhile, David wasn't even part of the army. Scripture tells us he was the youngest of Jesse's 8 sons, still tending his father's sheep back in Bethlehem, while his 3 oldest brothers served under Saul. David only arrived at the battle line because his father sent him to deliver bread and cheese to his brothers and check on how they were doing. Most retellings skip this entirely. David wasn't there looking for a fight. He was running an errand. Scripture doesn't leave his identity vague either. 1 Samuel 17:12 says, "Now David was the son of an Ephrathite named Jesse, who was from Bethlehem in Judah. Jesse had 8 sons, and in Saul's time he was very old." This isn't the language of legend. It's the language of a genealogy, a real family in a real town at a specific moment in Israel's history. That's when he saw it for himself. 1 Samuel 17:4 says, "A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. Every morning and every evening, he issued the same challenge. 'Choose a man and have him come down to me,' he shouted. 'If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us.' For 40 days, every morning and every evening, Israel listened to the same challenge. And every morning and evening, no one answered." Many people picture Goliath as well over 9 feet tall. One ancient reading of the text gives his height as 6 cubits and a span. Other very early manuscripts, including the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint, record 4 cubits and a span, making him around 6 feet 9 inches. Either way, Goliath was an exceptionally large and intimidating warrior by ancient standards. Wearing armor, Scripture describes in exact, almost clinical detail. A coat of scale armor, bronze greaves on his legs, and a bronze javelin slung across his shoulders, in addition to the spear and sword he carried into the valley. Goliath wasn't simply a monster wandering onto a battlefield either. He's described as a champion. In the ancient world, opposing armies sometimes settled conflicts by sending out a single best warrior from each side to fight in place of a full battle, sparing both sides mass bloodshed. That's exactly what Goliath was offering Israel. For 40 days, nobody answered him. David heard the challenge and heard something else too. The way the Israelite soldiers around him talked about Goliath in fear. Scripture records David asking, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" Notice what David focuses on. While everyone else in the Israelite camp saw Goliath's size, David saw Goliath's defiance of God. Goliath's 40 days of taunting weren't just a military threat in David's eyes. They were a direct insult to God himself, and it troubled David that nobody was answering it. Word of David's questions reached King Saul, who brought him in. And this is where the second myth needs correcting. Popular imagination usually pictures David as a small child, barely old enough to lift a weapon. But the text never says that. David was already the kind of young man trusted to manage his father's flocks alone in the wilderness, defending them against real predators. When Saul doubted whether David could face Goliath at all, David didn't describe himself as helpless. He said, "Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God." That's not the boast of a small child. That's the confidence of someone who had already faced down real danger and survived it, more than once. Saul offered David his own armor and sword. David tried them on. Scripture is specific about this, but then took them off, saying, "I cannot go in these, because I am not used to them." Notice what David actually objects to. He doesn't say the armor is too big or too heavy. He says he isn't used to it. His objection wasn't size, it was unfamiliarity. He had never trained or fought in that kind of armor, and he wasn't going to trust his life to equipment he hadn't tested in battle. Instead, he chose the tools he actually knew: a shepherd's staff, a pouch, 5 smooth stones from a nearby stream, and his sling. This is the myth most people get wrong without even realizing it. The idea that David's sling was some kind of child's toy, a symbol of weakness against Goliath's overwhelming strength. In the ancient world, that couldn't be further from the truth. Trained slingers were a serious, respected part of ancient armies, valued specifically because a sling in skilled hands could hurl a stone with enough force and accuracy to be lethal at a considerable distance. David wasn't walking into that valley with a toy. He was walking in with a weapon he had mastered through years of defending his flock, and a critical advantage Goliath didn't have: reach. A man in heavy armor, carrying weapons built for close combat, had no answer for a stone moving at killing speed before he ever closed the distance. Goliath, seeing only a young man without armor, mocked him. "Am I a dog," he said, "that you come at me with sticks?" He cursed David by his gods and threatened, "Come here and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals." David answered him with a declaration, not a boast. "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin," he said, "but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." Then he said something remarkable. "All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." That is the actual point of the story. Not that an underdog can win with enough courage, not that skill and preparation triumph over size. The text is explicit. The outcome was never framed as being about David's ability at all. It was a declaration that Israel's God is not defeated by human strength, no matter how large the threat looks. Then the two of them moved toward each other, and this detail surprises almost everyone who hears it for the first time. Scripture says David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. He didn't stand back cautiously and wait. He closed the distance himself. David put his hand into the bag and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. Goliath fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. 40 days of fear silenced in a single moment. When the Philistines saw their champion dead, they turned and ran, and the army of Israel chased them for miles. David took Goliath's own sword and cut off his head, and Scripture tells us he kept Goliath's armor in his own tent afterward. That detail matters later. Years after this battle, when David was fleeing for his life from a jealous King Saul, he arrived exhausted and unarmed at the town of Nob and asked the priest there if there was any weapon available. The priest's answer was simple: "The sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, is here." David took it, saying, "There is none like it." The same sword that once threatened to cut him down became the weapon he carried into hiding. Before David ever picked up a stone, he had already declared how the battle would end. The battle is the Lord's. That's the truth this story has proclaimed for 3,000 years. Goliath wasn't defeated because David believed in himself. He was defeated because David trusted the living God, and said so out loud before he ever threw the stone.